Hey there, welcome back. We are going to dive into production. We're out of pre-production. We've set up some templates. We've done some planning. We've done all the things we're supposed to be doing so that we're prepared to actually record. So here we go. We're jumping into production. The key is to be attentive, disciplined, and confident. That's what it takes to be a good host and a good, let's say, live talent. Even though this isn't live, we still want to think of ourselves as live talent because it's live for the people who are participating, right? Adhering to your pre-production plans. We have done a lot of work to save ourselves the stress of operating on the fly, aka winging it. We've planned, and so we know what we're doing. But sometimes, when that recording button gets clicked, new podcasters will throw all that planning out the window. I'd be like, oh God, I'm so nervous. I don't have time to look at any of this. I just got to stay with it. I got to stick with it. Part of this is nerves, and part of it is a desire to appear to your guest as a competent and flawless host. But no one is a flawless host, only a prepared and disciplined one. So an example of this might be, hey, I don't want to ask that question again, even though I asked it kind of wonkily, because if I ask it again, they'll think I'm a really shitty podcaster. When the truth is, you could just say, you know what, I don't like the way I asked that. Could I ask it again? And they'll say, sure. And this is not live, so you can do that, and no one will ever know after you've edited it. Adhering to your pre-production plans means having those plans in front of you. Remember, we talked about Podcast Studio Pro or ClickUp or any of those other options. You can have them on the screen in front of you, and you need to so that you're always ready. You know where you're going, you know what you've already covered, and maybe you've got that little notepad with some sidebar stuff on it. You want to have that stuff ready. You want to have it right in front of you. Always visible. No exceptions. Your episode outline or script should always be in front of you. You should always know where you are and where you're going. If you cannot quickly reference your episode outline or script, you will get flustered, you will get lost, you'll start to feel tense and anxious, and you're going to slip into winging it because you're like, it's too hard to stay confined to this thing I wrote. I've got to shirk it off, and I've got to go wild man or wild woman. When the truth is that tension you're feeling is you learning to be competent. That never feels good for anybody because it feels like sucking at first. But the more you do it, the less it will feel like sucking and the more it will feel like competency. Don't slip into winging it. Have your plans in front of you while you're producing an episode, while you're in actual production. Mastering tangents and sidebars. There can be no doubt, it's happened to me, it will happen to you, that during a conversation or even a monologue, something will come up that you didn't think about or plan for in pre-production. If you're monologuing and you've got an ADHD brain like me, that's going to be like, oh, I didn't think of this. I got to all of a sudden throw this in. Or your guest is going to say something in their answer that it will encourage you to ask a question that you don't have written down as something you were planning to ask, but clearly there would be some value there. And you know, once your audience hears it, they're going to be like, oh, I hope that John or Tiffany or whoever, whatever your name is, makes me think of my dad, Tanner, Sam, Hannah, whoever you are. It's going to make their ears perk up, and they're going to say, oh, I really wish that the host follows up on that. And it sucks in those situations where the host just kind of breezes over it and goes on to whatever was the next planned question. So that doesn't mean you should avoid any of these things, any of these thoughts that you might have, or these unexpected questions. If it's relevant and useful as a thought or a topic, it means you should learn how to fit it in. You know, how to adjust for the fact that it's there and you didn't expect it. That's one of the hardest things to learn how to do well. But you'll need to learn how to control your desire to immediately abandon your plan in order to address this unexpected thought or topic instead of sticking to your plan, but making space on the fly to talk about it. Now, I just talked about how we shouldn't do things on the fly. Well, this is production. We have to do some things on the fly. We have to be competent. We have to become competent enough to kind of like, I don't know, what's it called? Shuck and jive? I don't know. Like bob and weave when things come at us that we don't expect. But some of those things are useful, and we want to be able to turn around and use them. When something comes up, pick up your pencil, note it in your notebook. And when the current thought of conversation or thought or course of conversation is complete, say, a moment ago you said, and look at your notes, XYZ. Can we go back to that? And then go on that sidebar or tangent. But don't forget to return to your plan, which is right in front of you, so that'll be easy to do once you've successfully explored this unexpected thing. Because here are two things that suck. You've got great questions lined up because you did your research on your guest or, whatever it was, your monologue or whatever, and you've got this new thing that you didn't expect and you definitely want to dive into it, whether it's a monologue or an interview. It's just an unexpected thing, and you want to dive into it, but you don't want to dive into it at the expense of this other great stuff you've already got planned. So what will suck for the listener is you'll be asking a line of questioning to a guest, and they'll think, oh man, I know exactly where the host is going. I can't wait to hear their next question because I think I know what it is. And then you stop for a tangent, you go on a tangent, and then when you return, you're not on that same trajectory, right? And then the listener's like, well, shit, man, it's like they forgot where they were going. And that's really frustrating to the listener. So by writing things down, patiently waiting for the current course of questions to him or her to finish answering, or, whatever, opining, then you can say, hey, you said this thing. Can we touch on that for a minute? What did you mean by that? And then they give the answer, and then you can go back to whatever you had planned next if that little sidebar hadn't happened. Keeping time is really important. We have a tendency, I think, especially me, if you like to talk a lot, if you are like me and like to talk a lot, it's very easy for us to forget what is going on. It's a 30-minute episode, and all of a sudden it runs to 60 minutes or even 45 minutes. And you don't want that to happen because then you're in a situation in post-production where you're editing and you have to chop shit out that you don't want to chop out because you're trying to hit that consistency, that promise you made, that expectation you set about runtime that we went over in the first week at the outset of the podcast. So now you're having to trim out stuff that is really good, and you don't want to do that. You got to make tough decisions. So it's important to keep time so that we're not creating excess material that we can't use anyway. Now, I should say before I say that, sometimes an episode might run, instead of 30 minutes, it runs an hour. Well, that might be 2 episodes and you just got it in one sitting, and that could be a good thing. But, if you're not planning on doing that, the platform or software you're using to record, like let's say you're using Riverside or you're using Squadcast, it's going to help you keep time a little bit, but not very well. There will be a counter that tells you how long the recording's been running, for example, but it's not very likely that you're going to be looking at that while you're recording, especially if you're using Audacity to record. That'll probably be minimized and you'll be, monologuing to yourself or reading some notes or something like that. So you want something outside of the digital space to help you keep time. It works a lot better for whatever reason. I think you should buy some sort of visual timer that counts up so as to keep track of how much time you've taken up and to know how fast your deadline is approaching, and to note approximate timestamps of notes, important timestamps. Did you retake a line? Well, you're going to have to edit that retake later, so when you retake that line, you should look at the timer, see what it says, and then write down the time so you can find that point in the audio. So it's faster in post-production. You can get right to that thing. Note the time. Did the guest ask you to take something out? Note the time. Be easier to find it, right? If the timer counts up and you start it at approximately the same time you start the actual recording, it's not going to line up exactly, because even if you try to start 2 things at the same time, one's going to be slightly off, but it'll be close enough that you'll be able to find it quickly in post-production. Now, of course, when you're editing in post-production and you're jumping to something on the timeline and cutting it out, it's important to remember that you would want to make the last correction first, because if you make the first correction first, and I want to make sure that I'm going to bring up my camera here a little bit. So you've got a timeline, right? And you've got the beginning of the timeline and the end of the timeline. And if you cut things from the end of the timeline towards the beginning, that's okay. But if you cut things from the beginning of the timeline, well, you make a cut and then it collapses. You make a cut and then it collapses. And then you make a cut and it collapses. And what will happen is you'll throw off all the timelines, so they won't be accurate. The timestamps, they won't be accurate anymore. So when you edit in post-production, you want to make the last timestamp edit first. and work yourself towards the first one so that you don't have that problem. Okay, so we can go back to the slide now. Always have a pencil and notepad near you for these purposes. Don't type out on the screen because no one listening to your podcast wants to hear. I mean, like if I do it right now, well, I'm not going to do it because it'll mess up the template, but you could probably hear this. Nobody wants to hear that in the background of you talking. It's distracting. So unless you have a very silent keyboard, and keep in mind, these microphones' jobs are to hear better than we do. So don't think that just because your keyboard is quote unquote silent, that your microphone's not going to hear it. So use a notepad and paper instead. Taking notes. Now, again, this might be redundant because I already talked about taking notes, but I don't want to assume that you've gotten my point yet. You should be taking handwritten notes during the recording, okay? I think you've probably seen interviews of, classic interviewers. Cronkite maybe, he's sitting there and he's interviewing the Queen of England or something, and he's making notes as he does it, and then later on he'll look at it, and that is Walter Cronkite, right? Like that's somebody who really knows their stuff, and they're taking notes. Are you better than Walter Cronkite? Probably not. You wouldn't be taking this class. So take handwritten notes during the recording, okay? Not only will it ensure that your mind doesn't wander and forget something, it will also ensure that those unplanned thoughts that pop into your mind get returned to when and if there's adequate time to do so. You will 100% think of things in production that you didn't think of in pre-production, and so a notepad and a pencil, they make sure that you can take advantage of these thoughts in a way that doesn't throw anyone off. Anyone means you, the guest, and the person or people listening. Keeping notes like this also ensures that if there is a lull in the conversation, that there's a good chance something unplanned in your notes could be used to fill that void. So if there's like this awkward silence and you don't know where to go next, and you're keeping notes of thoughts you had as someone was answering a question, you can go, oh shit, well I actually have something that I might be able to throw in here that I wasn't planning for. That's especially helpful when, and this will happen, as someone who's a first-time creator in an interview-style podcast, what will frequently happen is that you'll write 10 questions expecting it to take your full runtime, but then you'll nervously go through them too quickly. And you're like, oh shit, I've got 10 minutes left and I'm already done with all my questions. What now? Well, if you've got that notepad that's got your thoughts on it, you might be able to fix that for yourself. Also important to remember that this is not live. The greatest gift of podcasts and podcast production is that it isn't live. That means if you mess up, you can stop and you can ask, hey, can we take that again? It also means you can ease the mind of your guests. If you say something that you didn't mean to say, no big deal. You can re-ask the question. So you can say that to your guest. Hey, by the way, before we get started, if you say something you didn't mean to say, or you say it and you meant to say it, but at the end of the interview you think like, maybe that'd be a little inappropriate, I don't want to get myself into trouble, just tell me and I can take it out. Nothing here is on permanent record. It can all be edited. We want to make you look great, so be comfortable. This is a safe place for you to mess up, and don't worry, we won't leave it in the tape, so to speak. It is critical to understand this, too. If you flub something or you say something you shouldn't have, that is okay. Just take a breath, reset, and take the line a second time, a third time, a fourth time. It doesn't matter because you're going to edit those mistakes out later. If rather you don't want to prioritize your own comfort and feeling of professionalism, and you don't want to feed your ego during production, you don't want to hold that as being more important than the ultimate quality of the outcome. So if you mess up something or you ask something in a way that could have been asked better, don't say, I'm not going to go back and change that. I want to seem professional, or I'm way too good to go back and retake that line. That would make me look stupid. Don't do that, because ultimately the person who pays the price for that is the listener. And I guess if the listeners aren't happy, maybe your podcast won't be successful in the long run. So this isn't the 6 o'clock live news, okay? You can mess up and retake the line. Now, if you are doing a live podcast, I don't recommend that. You'd have to be a lot more disciplined to do that. But 99.9% of podcasts are not live. They're pre-recorded. Calls to action. Every podcast episode should ask the listener to do something. For example, to visit your website, review the podcast, send you an email, to provide feedback, fill out a survey, maybe follow you on social, something. You should be asking the audience to do something in every episode. This is called a CTA, or a call to action. CTAs are often located at the end of the show, and that's where I tend to place them as well. Also, you don't want more than one CTA per episode. So you don't want to say, hey, go review, then subscribe, follow, and then email me to let me know what you think. That's too many CTAs. They're going to be like, well, which one do they want me to fucking pick? And then they won't pick anything. So spread CTAs out over the episode. So use like, your call to action to follow you on Twitter on one episode, and then on another one you can ask them for a review, and then on another one you can ask them to subscribe or follow or whatever. Just make sure that you're not dumping it all on them all at once. Give them one at a time. It's a very specific request. It has a much better chance of converting. That is to say, it's more likely they'll do the thing you asked them to do if you just give them one thing to do instead of a bunch. So, for example, if you want to ask for reviews, hey, reviews help others decide whether to give this podcast a try when coming across it for the first time. So please, if you haven't already, I'd greatly appreciate it if you left a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or Podchaser.com. Thanks. And then in the next episode, hey, thanks for listening. If you'd like to connect during the week when I'm not podcasting, check out my Twitter at twitter.com/Mikey's Microphone and give me a follow. That's a very specific ask. More likely to do the one thing you ask them instead of one of the 5 things you ask them to do, okay? So keep that in mind. Prepping your guests one more time. Okay, so it's important. I think this might be a little bit out of order, but in this module, in this week, you're going to see a way to create a template that you can send to your guest ahead of time. Okay, so some of the things and I'm just covering my butt here because I'm realizing as I'm reading this that I'm doing this out of order, but some things you want to make sure you do with your guest, and again, there will be a separate video to talk about this. I'm just doing things out of order like a doofus, and I want to make sure you hear it twice. You want to make sure that you give your guest some kind of document that explains to them how to join your Riverside session or your Squadcast session or something. You want to give them some instruction, physical instruction or digital on a screen instruction that they can actually look at and say, oh, okay, that's how I do it. Great. I've got some instructions before going into this, like 2 weeks before, so that they have it and they're ready. Oh, and you need headphones. Oh, okay. So I know I need headphones. And anything that you want them to know before getting started. I also like to schedule like a 10-minute phone call with the potential guest, maybe a few days out or a week out, so that we can build a little bit of a rapport. And the reason I do that, I'm talking to you in front of a yellow screen, so let me bring myself up here. The reason that I do that is because, I used to own a brick and mortar studio in Maine, and I noticed one day that I had a young woman come for an interview, and the door of a studio is a very thick door. When you close it, it's like ka-chunk, like, because it's keeping sound in and out, so to speak. And I recognized when I did that I could tell she got a little uncomfortable. And I was like, I wonder why she and then I thought, oh, well, this is the first time we've met. And I just shut and locked a door. Now I'm alone in this room with a woman who has no idea who I am. I'm just here to interview her. Am I a creep? There's no rapport. Now, of course, that doesn't really apply in a situation where you're meeting someone online to have an interview. However, there's some awkwardness when you're just sitting down to talk with somebody who you've never spoken to before. You have no rapport with them. So if you can schedule a virtual coffee, or in my case, what I started doing after that was actual physical coffees. This was well before the pandemic. You can spend 10 minutes with them, 15 minutes with them. If you go get coffee, spend an hour with them if you can, and they get to know you a little bit. And maybe you ask them some questions you were going to ask them anyway to kind of plant the seeds of expectation that they are going to be asked those things. And then when you virtually lock them into the room with you, they already kind of know you. They already kind of like you a little bit. They've already got your vibe, and they feel safer with you, more comfortable with you than they would have having just met you for the very first time. So that's a good idea too. So do that. Now, we'll also say prepping your guests one more time. Even after they connect, right? You've opened up Riverside. They've joined the meeting, right? They've joined the call, and you're about to hit record. this is out of order, so I haven't actually done this, but I mentioned checklists, prep calls in prior modules, which I didn't, out of order, whoopsie doopsies. But here's the thing. Your guest may have listened to absolutely nothing you said when you provided that training or made that call, okay? The more busy the guest, the more lackadaisical the guest, the more likely it is that they are like, hey, yeah, sure, yeah, I get it. I've done this before. I know what I'm doing. I'm a genius. They don't listen to a damn thing you say. So before you hit record in Riverside or Squadcast or whatever you're using, Boomcaster, make sure you take a few minutes of hitting that button, that record button, to test that everything is working. The biggest miss that happens, and man, it really sucks in post-production, you realize it happened there and you didn't catch it, is when they think they're using their fancy microphone. But in fact, they are using their built-in shitty laptop microphone. And they're like, no, I'm totally using this. And you're like, I don't know, it sounds kind of shitty. And they're like, nope, positive. I mean, I'm very smart. I know exactly what I'm doing. And you're like, all right, I guess I'm going to trust you. So here's what you can do. You can have them tap on the microphone. Now notice if I tap on my desk, you can hear that. Like I'm going to tap on the microphone up here that's built into my monitor. You can hear that, but that sounds different than this, right? There's a big difference. You can tell that this is tapping on my monitor and this is tapping on my microphone, okay? So we want to make sure that tap really helps you to identify if the microphone they're actually using is the one they think they're using. And if you can hear that rustle, that noise, then that's good. They're in the right microphone. So the best way to test it. And if they're not, you can say, oh, yeah, I don't even hear that. I mean, you'll hear the tapping, but you can tell them you don't hear anything. And they'll say, oh, that's weird. And then you can walk them through how to select the correct microphone in Riverside. Now, again, out of order, there'll already be a video going over this, but it's going to be after this video. So look down there. It's down there somewhere. It's in a module by itself or it's below this video. Okay, so onward to the next thing. Whatever that is, I'm clearly out of order. So I'm not out of order. You're out of order. And we'll see you in the next video.